Very good. Just starting these. My name's Tim. I'm an alcoholic. I'm actually recording this, so when we get to the Q&A, don't reveal secrets, okay? Just plain questions. If you don't want your voice recorded, I can turn these off and while you're asking the question. So don't say anything you wouldn't want broadcast. So I'm an alcoholic. I'm from London. I'm 32 years sober. So I used to be, I remember vaguely being a young person. Now, the thing about being a sort of older person at young person's AA, it can feel like you're on the outside, but they say, you know, as long as you're young at heart. Well, I'm not. I'm old at heart. And then they said, well, you're young, if you've got room to grow, any more growth, if it happens, great. If it dies, growth is very painful. I don't know. I'm not gagging to grow more. But the Factive Young Persons Convention is an excellent example of the application of the traditions, because the traditions are not a set of rules, they're not a set of laws, they're a set of principles. Now, the difference between a law and a principle, or a rule and a principle, is a rule doesn't involve any thought, any judgment, any discretion. If the sign says, keep off the grass, you keep off the grass. You don't have to think about it, you just have to do it. Now, you'll notice with the traditions there are 12 of them, not one of them. And they work against each other. And so to work out how to apply the traditions in any situation, you've got to judge the relative importance of the traditions to the situation in question. It's no good in a business meeting or a group conscience meeting or anything else brandishing one of the traditions like a weapon as though it trumps all of the other ones. Now, one of the controversial, I'm going to deal with the elephant in the room first. One of the controversial aspects of young persons' conventions is the proposition that their existence breaches the traditions, that the existence of so-called special interest groups, young people's groups, gay and lesbian and whatever groups, I'm a whatever, I think, I don't fit neatly into boxes. Men's meetings, women's meetings, all of those. Just over 20 years ago, there was a move through conference to have all of the special interest groups, of which there were many and still are, to have them delisted from the official listings of meetings in Alcoholics Anonymous in Great Britain. And I, being a bit of a busybody and not having done enough Al-Anon meetings at that point, took it upon myself to organise something of a resistance movement against this. So I contacted every single special interest group in the country, and there were scores of them, to say, FYI, this is being discussed at conference. If you don't want your group to be delisted, you might want to go to an intergroup meeting and have your voice heard, or a region meeting, or talk to your delegate, or whatever. And anyway, I wasn't involved in conference that year. I'd been involved in conference other years. I wasn't involved in conference that year, but what happened is that motion was killed. So the reason we have special interest groups now still listed is partly because that proposal, that motion, that movement 20 odd years ago was scotched by a lot of people working very hard to make sure their voices were heard. Now, the question is, well, why did people bring that in the first place? Now, the obvious knee-jerk response is, well, people just don't like minorities and differences, and I'm sure there were some arseholes involved in that. But there was actually a genuine principle. When I went to my first meeting, I looked round, which was January 1993. I'm sober since July 1993. There's a 6-month hiatus there, which is a very polite word for a very messy period. But anyway, I looked around the meeting And I thought, this is a rum do. This is a very, very strange collection of people. These are very clearly people who would not mix. It says in the book on page 17, we are people who normally would not mix. I didn't know that line, but I had that principle demonstrated, that this is a messy mixture of people, of young people, old people, straight people, gay people, people of different ethnicities, people of different social demographics, you know, the dustman to the duchess thing. You know, there are... There's European royalty in AA. There are homeless people in AA. There's everything in between. And the great thing is going into a meeting and getting precisely the advice you need from someone who doesn't know you and with whom you have nothing in common. And you, especially, I don't know about you, I'm sure you've all gotten over this if you've ever been like this. I was a bit of a victim when I got to AA, which meant that if I felt bad, it was everyone else's fault. And the chief way that got scotched was by finding people who had radically different lives but had the same emotions. And I thought, it's not my circumstances, it's not my background, it's not where I grew up, it's not my parents, it's not the country I come from, it's not my ethnicity, it's not my religion, it's not my sex, it's not my sexual orientation, it's none of those things. I am the problem. And I got that because I went to meetings and saw radically different people all saying the same thing. Now, having said that, I went to special interest groups. I went to a gay and lesbian group for the first 8 years of my recovery. It was pretty much my home group on a Friday. And if you're new in AA, Friday and Saturday night, go to a meeting, go for dinner afterwards. If no one is going for dinner, get people to go for dinner. You need a sufficient substitute to people out there having fun. You need to be doing something interesting and meeting people and whatever. Anyway, that's what we did on Friday nights. And so in my first 10 years, I had both experiences. I had regular meetings with lots of people in them, all very different, and I had the special interest meetings. And there are virtues of both. But one thing that I don't go to any special interest groups at the moment, not saying I wouldn't again, but what's interesting, my home group has got representatives of every imaginable ethnicity and I mean, if you counted the genders in the room, there'd probably be 17 if people were forced to write down what... Do you know what I mean? It's a very mixed group. I remember a few years ago, it was a much bigger group before COVID, and I remember there was a Brazilian-Japanese person sitting next to a Hasidic Jew from North London, and the restaurant staff were completely baffled. Now, one of the reasons I like this is because when I go to a gay meeting, which I do very occasionally, I'm very aware that, let's say there are 35, 40 people in the room who are gay. If we'd all gone to a different meeting that day, there'd be 40 gay people in 40 different meetings. Those meetings have now been stripped of gay people who've all been put into this sort of single ghetto. It turns all of the other meetings, it skews the demographic of other meetings. And I was young when I got sober, when I went to young persons meetings in other countries, I noted that the young people's meetings were absolutely buzzing with people, and then nearby I'd go to another meeting, this was in America, where all of the old people were, and there were no young people. Why were there no young people? Because the young people were at the young people's meetings. So it's not, as it were, a victimless crime. In other words, every choice made has an effect in some other way. Every application of a tradition affects another tradition, which is why one can't brandish them. Now, so the justification against special interest groups and conventions and blah, 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 is that they skew the demographic, they put people in different camps, there's this sort of Orwellian, some people are a little bit more welcome than others. Everyone's welcome, but some people are a little bit more welcome than others. There is a dynamic there, and I can understand why people object to that. But tradition 5, primary purpose, is to carry the message and stay sober. The most compelling arguments two compelling arguments I heard for gay meetings and women's meetings. One, men's meetings, I have no idea why they're there, but that's not a vulnerable group. But with gay meetings, I remember talking 25 years ago, when this whole furore happened in relation to the special interest groups. I talked to someone from a gay and lesbian group in Manchester, and they said that it had been started because a couple of people had some real jip at a local meeting where there was a couple of homophobic arseholes and blah, 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 and they didn't represent the fellowship as a whole, but they just wanted somewhere where they wouldn't have to even potentially face that kind of crap going on. I understand that. I've had sponsees, female sponsees. There's a T-shirt they were selling at a AA conference in San Francisco where it says the men sponsor the women, men sponsor the men, the women sponsor the women, and the gays sponsor everyone. So I was sponsoring a woman many years ago who'd been a sex worker, and she would go to women's meetings where she would find lots of really vulnerable people who'd had a really bad 10 or 20 years at the hands of human traffickers or what other situations. And they just needed somewhere to defrost for a while without having to face the other sex. I understand that. There are lots of reasons why special interest groups might exist. So here, tradition 3 would suggest that there's no requirement for membership or attendance and no suggestion of conformity. That's an argument against special interest groups. Tradition 5, carrying the message, if you need to have the special interest groups to carry the message, go for it. And when Barry L., as his name was, who actually, I think, went on to write Living Sober. I'm not an AA historian, so if I'm wrong about that, forgive me. But maybe it was him, or maybe it was him that told the story. When they first started considering the notion of special interest groups in, I think, the 1940s, and I have a feeling it was a group for African Americans in Boston, they wrote to Bill Wilson and said, is this in accordance with AA principles? And he said, is it one of the lengths you need to go to stay sober? And they said, yes. He said, therefore, it's in accordance with the principles. So above the traditions lies the general principle. What works? The 12 traditions are an outworking of that at different levels, but ultimately it's not about laws, it's about what is going to help people stay sober. And the two basic pillars of the traditions, I think, are tradition 1, unity, and tradition 5, primary purpose. All of the other ones hang on that. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of these traditions. And by the way, try and think of questions, or we're going to have a very dull 15 minutes at the end of this hour. Tradition 1, let's read it out. Do we have it somewhere there? Our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. I was doing a step 5 many years ago with a bloke called Spiritual Paul. He was called Spiritual Paul because Paul was his name and he was thought of as spiritual. And he was. They called him that because he used to talk about God a lot. Now, it doesn't mean if you don't talk about God, you're not spiritual, but you know how AA nicknames work. There was a man called Ironing Board Arthur who got sober in the 1950s, who talked about an ironing board for the first 6 months of his sobriety, which he'd made in some day centre or something, and it stuck for 50 years. But anyway, step 5, Spiritual Paul. He said, who founded AA? And I said, well, it was Bill W. and Dr. Bob. And he said, wrong. They weren't the founders of AA. They were the co-founders of AA. God was the founder of AA. Now, everything that AA has, and by the way, there are lots of technical talks about traditions available online. Go and find them. if you want to know the technical details. I've only got 40 minutes, so I've got to do a very high-level thing here. The point of saying that about the founding is that there is nothing that AA offers which is not available elsewhere in one way or another. What AA does is it combines things from different places and then tailors them. It puts everything into one pot. So if you look at all of the principles of the AA program in the big book, really from page 63 to page 88, 89, if you took those ideas and you read them against traditional Catholicism, against traditional Judaism, against other religions, you'd be able to do one-for-one matches all the way through. So in Judaism, when you get to Yom Kippur, in the late part, we're just coming up to it now, one of the things you do before you get forgiven by God, you go around to all the people that you've hacked off or done over in the past year, and you apologize. You can't go and ask God for forgiveness until you've made amends. Does that sound familiar? Then there's a public confession where you recount all of the things that you've done wrong, and you do it as a community. It's called the Al-Chetz in Judaism. Everything in the steps you will find in Judaism. Everything in the steps you'll find in Christianity. You'll find some other stuff in Christianity and Judaism you won't find in the steps. But the essence of the program is from elsewhere. The medical knowledge which sits at the basis of AA came from outside AA. Even the notion of helping other people in the way that we do in AA actually came from the Oxford groups, which was a so-called first century Christianity organisation in the early part of the 20th century. So we've taken things from elsewhere. The one thing which is different is it's one alcoholic talking to another. And this is why we have what is referred to in one of the forewords to the big book as this wholesale miracle. And a miracle is something which appears to run against the laws of nature. So if you've got, and this is a digression, so forgive me. Imagine a billiard table and you've got balls moving across the billiard table. Now imagine that the billiard players are invisible, and you suddenly see one of the balls which is heading in accordance with the laws of physics along the green baize of the billiard table. Then you suddenly see it moving, changing direction, going off in another direction. You can't see the person with the cue, but you know someone must have taken a cue and hit it. They haven't breached the laws of nature. They've worked with the laws of nature to bring about a change. And the trajectory of my alcoholism was that I was heading into the ground very quickly. I was very ill physically in 1993. I was very ill mentally in 1993. I was very disordered socially. I would get arrested and all sorts of things. And my life suddenly, boom, started going in a completely new direction and has been trundling along in that new direction for 30 years. A miracle is an intervention. And there was this radical intervention. And alcoholics had been getting sober, a little one here, a little one there, occasional examples of miracles happening. But what we have is a system to turn some kind of tailored artisanal spiritual awakening into mass market spiritual awakening. You got a problem? Come in, work 12 steps, you'll be just fine. And it works in AA, it works in other fellowships. But it works because we have a fellowship. Now, you could say, do we even need a fellowship? Why don't we just find other alcoholics to work with? It's very hard to find alcoholics who want to get well. There's a line in the big book, Future Fellows of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's in chapter 11. As we were... I've had a bit of a dramatic morning. My phone died, and not in the sense of running out of juice, but just ceasing to operate. And I'm from somewhere else, so this is a bit of a big deal. So we went and sorted it out, got a new phone, and on the way back, as I was feeling this huge relief that we've sorted this problem out and I can get here on time, we saw lots of future fellows of Alcoholics Anonymous gathering a little group under a little pergola in a green space, and some other people walking along the street, one person walking very quickly, another person walking behind them shouting, you know that scene, both of them walking jerkily like something out of World War Z. Future fellows of Alcoholics Anonymous are everywhere. I got up at about 10 to 5 this morning. I know, that's what happens when you're 32 years sober. You get up at 10 to 5 like an old person. And I went for a run, and the centre of Manchester, if you've ever been there at 5 o'clock in the morning, there are some people for whom it's still Friday. Future fellows of Alcoholics Anonymous. You try carrying the message to any of them, good luck to you. What the fellowship of AA provides is this endless pool of people to whom I can carry the message in order that I can stay sober. The reason God gives me a defense against the first drink is because I'm more useful sober than I am drunk. What does the use consist in? Helping other people have a spiritual awakening. So I was woken up by AA. My job is to help other people wake up. I need a fellowship to do that. So my life depends on there being a fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is why the unity is so important. And I think it's super helpful. Wherever you go in the world, they have this one basic text, and that's the end of it. The stories at the back, Australia has its own stories. We've got the American stories, which we seem relatively happy with. A couple of years ago, there was a thing at a conference about getting some British stories. I don't think that's taken off. I may be wrong. The stories might vary, but the basic text stays the same. What does that ensure? It means wherever you go, you're talking the same language. If you go to another country and they're talking about the steps, all of the lingo is the same, all the jargon is the same, which means we can communicate with each other. And there's an important part of tradition one, which is our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. What that means is when you read the long form, so the traditions has got a short form and a long form. The long form explains the tradition more fully, and then Bill W., who wrote the traditions, who enshrined them, really he didn't write them. AA had loads of really bad experiences for 20 years. He was listening very carefully. He was traveling around. He heard all the stories at the General Service Office, the World Service Office in New York. They would get letters from people the whole time, you know, our group's just fallen apart because Janet just how do you handle this? So they knew everything that had gone wrong. Bill condensed what worked versus what didn't work into the traditions. Short form, long form explains them. But his essays in language of the heart, his grapevine essays, which are collected in language of the heart, do the real explaining of what's behind them. Unity comes first, personal recovery comes second, but it's a very close second. So the individual is important, but the group is more important. So if I'm in a business meeting or a group conscience meeting, not causing a shit show is more important than getting my point across. And I have to stifle 19 out of 20 things I want to say at business meetings or group conscience meetings, because unity is now more important to me than having my say. My group is reasonably strong, I think. It's not as big as it used to be, but I think 35, 40 is about the right number, so I'm actually glad it's the size it is. But over the years, I've seen lots of really, really strong groups in AA, and I've seen almost all of them fold. And it's a shame, because there's a body of experience and a spirit and a culture of those groups which gets built up. And there are lots of different reasons. The story about why each group fails is different. But there's a really strong theme that runs through, and it is this: strong groups tend to attract people who try kind of wishy-washy approaches to AA, and they keep relapsing, even though lots of people don't. The miracle of AA, of AA. It's so strong, it strikes a lot of people sober. And they stay sober without having to do the steps, or doing the steps very slowly, or doing the steps piecemeal, and they're just fine. And then there are people who, like me, that absolutely need full-on steps, traditions, concepts, sponsorship, blah, 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 all of those things, in order even to stay sober. Strong groups tend to cluster people who are absolutely effed unless they put everything into this. And people can get resentful at meetings where you just kind of tip up and share what your week was like. Nothing wrong with those meetings, but they're not so good for people like me. And sometimes groups that are strong get this sense they're special and different. They're the ones with the real gear. And a division, a separation can take place between that group and AA as a whole. And you see it everywhere. Where there's a strong group, it almost always has a reputation, and there is almost always hostility in neighbouring groups towards it. And that's coming from the strong group. The problem is not the rest of AA, it's this subtle attitude of superiority. So I've got to be really careful personally and in how I operate in my group, not to eat. You hear AA talks on the internet and they say, my name is so-and-so and I'm from blah, 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 North Dakota, and it's the best AA group in the world. And if you're ever in North Dakota on a Friday evening, drop by and we'll look at. Very, very nice, very good invitation. But it's the best AA group in the world. Is it now? So the others aren't good enough. That's interesting. I've got to be really wary of that kind of attitude. A group which is much more soft, much more gentle, where they don't talk about the steps, where people talk about their week and their day and just share their feelings, that's working for those people, and good luck to them. My group is not better. It's better for me, but it's not better full stop. So I have to know in AA what's good for me, but not treat that as a reason to feel superior or separate. I've got to be able to go anywhere in AA. Anyone is going to put some people's backs up. 1 in 10 people is just not going to like you. Deal with it. But I need to be able to go anywhere in AA and not put more people's backs up than I strictly need to, if I'm just going to meetings. Which means I adopt the tone of the meeting I'm in. I don't try and run against it in any way. Tradition 5, though, suggests that the primary purpose comes first, which means my focus from when I walk in through the door at the beginning until I leave fellowship at the end of the evening is to carry the message of AA, preferably without making it look as though I'm doing that. How do you carry the message of AA? The best way to do it is to be in a good mood. So I've got to watch my behaviour in AA. I've got to watch my behaviour at fellowship afterwards. A few weeks ago at fellowship, there was, should we say, a contentious fellow. And I saw the bait lying there at the dinner table, and I thought, don't touch the bait, and I was all right. And then I saw the bait twitching, and I thought, don't touch the bait. And then I touched the bait, and I got in there. And I felt great at the time, and I felt awful afterwards, because I had not made that experience an attractive experience for that other person. So I've got to be careful in AA that I am demonstrating the principles, which means FHB, family hold back, keep my big fat mouth shut a lot of the time. If I feel emotionally churned, the body doesn't lie, means I might not be consciously aware that I'm disturbed in a situation, but I will recognize that I'm physically tense, that my throat is tensed up, that my foot starts twitching. Everyone's got their own little signs. You know that something is up, and your body tells you before your mind does. When I'm like that, shut up. This is in no particular order. Tradition 9 talks about AA as such ought never be organised. Well, that's an understatement. But we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those days. So the spiritual principle, one little point, there are spiritual principles behind all of the traditions, and not just like one per tradition or one per step. There are scores of them. And to look for those is very helpful, because those then become principles that one can apply in one's life, which I'm going to talk about, I think it's between 3 and 4 o'clock. And the reason that's important, the steps sort me out internally and with God. And they give me a little bit to do in steps 8 and 9, go and pay back the money, apologise to people for pushing them down the stairs or setting fire to them. Whatever one did to them, you apologise, and then you carry the message. But essentially, it's internal, it's between you and God. But I don't know if you've noticed, there are a lot of people out there, 8 billion. I need a system for handling the 8 billion people out there, or at least those that I'm coming across. And the traditions are a set of principles which I can use to do that. Because what do? They help the group hang together. They help the group get on with other groups without making enemies. And they help groups and AA get on with society around. I'll give you a good example of that. It's a principle in the traditions and in the concepts that when we're criticised in AA at public level, the policy is complete silence. Don't say a damn thing. What you can do is write privately to the organisation or the individual saying, couple of factual errors which we want to correct. Here they are. Have a good day. No argument, no retaliation. Just imagine if you went through your life, whenever you are criticised, not retaliating, not arguing, maintaining complete silence, but only quietly and discreetly correcting errors. How many difficult situations that would avoid. But that was a digression. Tradition 9, about minimal organisation. What that means is the group should be as organised as necessary, but as little organised as possible. And what tends to happen, anything that starts spiritually tends to end up material. And that's a very old principle. It predates AA. And I'll give you an example. There's a story to illustrate this. And this is an Anthony de Mello story. He's not conference-approved literature yet. Anthony de Mello's story about a Buddhist temple somewhere where the old Buddhist monk had a cat, and the cat would come and sit next to him during the ceremony. And eventually, he died, but the cat continued to come along and come and sit next to the person officiating. And then the cat died, but they'd forgotten why the cat had even been there in the first place. So they got another cat to come along, and they forced a cat to sit there as though it was part of the ceremony, but no one knew why it was there. And if you look at the script of any AA group, and they go on for pages, and I have to say this is a contentious view. If you think AA is bad for scripts, Al-Anon, Jesus. You're 20 minutes in before a human being says a real thing. It just goes on and on and on. And I went to a meeting in I won't say where, AA meeting, where they had all of these announcements. And then it's an hour-long meeting, and then they read from the 12 and 12 for 25 minutes. And then there was like 10 minutes of sharing, and then they had chips and lots of other things. If you take the script of your AA group, almost every single thing that is in there is there because someone had a grievance or wanted to control someone else's behaviour. And you get these rules upon rules upon rules upon rules upon rules, and no one remembers why they're there. And no one listens to them anyway. They're just killing time. Some human beings have come all the way to tell us their experience, strength, and hope. Maybe we want to listen to them a little more. The point of the structure is to create a space in which human beings tell the truth in such a way that might actually help other people. But what happens is the structure builds up and builds up and builds up, and you end up with, like, as that meeting I described, 10 minutes of sharing, and everything else is the structure for the 10 minutes of sharing. What's the most successful group in the world? It can't be answered. But sometimes it is said, there's a group in California which is described as the most successful AA group in the world by some people because it's very, very large. So on I think before COVID, now it's smaller. But before COVID, you would get 1,500 people at the meter. I think the Wednesday night got 1,500 people. I've been there a few times, and it was the most well-organized thing I've ever seen. It was like it was like an Olympic ceremony, and they had cakes. The cakes were plastic, and I think that's a good symbol of what was going on there. There was the symbol of people having birthday cakes, but you couldn't eat the cake. And they'd haul out the same plastic cake for all the birthdays, and everyone would sing happy birthday to you and go into three-part harmony at the end. It was Los Angeles, of course they went into three-part harmony at the end. And this whole production number, and I can't tell you, I was as bored as I've ever been. And the more structured and formal, there are some meetings where people wear ties and suits and things, and if you don't share the right thing, your sponsor's going to have a real word with you afterwards, and people are told exactly what to share. Dull, dull, dull. Why? Because it's organised. It may be useful for certain types of people, but there's a reason why those meetings are in a minority. Most people, it doesn't suit. So my ideal meeting is a meeting where you have the absolute minimal script, and you get on to human beings talking as quickly as possible and just cut away all the crap. No opinion on outside matters. And it's so interesting. And I know it's conference approved, the medical advice notice, but the medical advice notice is an opinion itself on an outside issue, which is how the human beings in AA discuss their medical matters with each other and with their families and with their doctors and blah, blah, blah. Not AA's business, in my view. It contains opinions, it implies a position. AA is really helpful when it stays out of politics, when it stays out of religion, when it stays out of views on the treatment industry, which is another thing that people fall out on. And I think it's important at fellowship afterwards to stay out of those topics as well. And what's important at fellowship, to talk about fellowship as well, because it's not a formal part of AA, but a very good AA speaker called Don P. from Aurora, Colorado. That's what it says on his publicly available recordings. It died many, many years ago now. I highly recommend him. If you never hear any other AA speaker, listen to him repeatedly. Find everything you can. Don P. One of the things he says is the meeting, you need to get it over with. You have to have the meeting. But the important thing is what happens afterwards. And I need to practice the traditions at fellowship. And one of the ways, tradition 1, unity, I don't want to be holding private conversations with another person at the table. I can do that. We can get a room afterwards if we want to do that. We really don't need, because as soon as there's a private conversation at the table, there's a wall around that conversation and the people can't get past it to the people on the other side. So my responsibility at fellowship is to help the group of people, to play my part in the group of people having a conversation together in a way that everyone can take part in. And I remember there were some friends of mine a few years ago at fellowship. They would get together at the end of the table and talk about politics and history. And they knew a lot about politics and history. But no one else at the table did. No one else cared. And they were there, but they weren't there. And I tell you, in my view, it didn't do them any good in the long term. So my job at fellowship, it's not there for culinary purposes, and it's not there for entertainment or even social purposes. It's something different. It's a way of being together in a more informal way than the meeting is. So I've gone on for 40 minutes. Should we see if there are any questions?
Yeah, or if you, just give you 5 minutes to kind of bring it to a...
Well, I've just done that. So
yeah. Okay.
So we'll see if there are any questions. If there are just blank faces, I'll just carry on talking. Yeah. So, and does anyone have anything they'd like to hear? Because there's so much we haven't covered. Does anyone have a question or experience they want some input on? Or
Jessica, alcoholic. I have several questions. I'll do one at a time.
Very good.
I was recently outvoted 8-1 at a group conscience, and the group had decided to introduce the line saying, please be mindful of your language and refrain from profanity. My point was, this is AA, it's not the Women's Institute. And I knew it was a group where they always vote with the two most sober people, even though those people aren't dominating.
Yeah.
They do follow traditions. I just wondered what your thoughts were on that. I know that, well, I don't know actually, but you know, it was a loving God as he expresses himself in our group conscience, but I just wondered what your thoughts would have been if you'd been in that group conscience.
Well, so that covers a lot of interesting points, and I'm going to reiterate the question or the situation in part for the tapes, because it might not have picked up your voice. So you've got a situation, group conscience, 8-1, 8 in favour of introducing a line against the use of profanity, but the argument is, you know, should we be controlling people in that way? I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is I think I'd be with you on that. F that. I love the fact in Tradition 3 it says no conformity is required at all. I mean, I am a bit of a swearer. I'm not the biggest swearer, and sometimes it can be grating when every third word is a swear word. But one thing I'd say in favour of that group conscience is that there was an American Supreme Court judge called Felix Frankfurter. I think he was one of Roosevelt's appointees, I'm not sure. But he said there are matters on which reasonable people of goodwill can disagree. And the profanity one is one of those. I can understand the arguments. It's a spiritual program and we're here to achieve spiritual ends. We're not. I can understand the arguments, but I can understand the arguments on the other side. And that's why we have Tradition 4, which says we'll do what we want and you do what you want, and no one needs to fall out over it. I think the other interesting part of that is how I handle a group conscience or a business meeting not going my way, or how we get to that point where there's something contentious. And this is where Tradition 11 comes in, attraction, not promotion. If I've got an idea and I present the idea and people don't immediately descend on the idea like ravening beasts saying that's an amazing idea, if they're not buying it, it's because it's a stinker. And it does not need me to sell the idea. If it doesn't sell itself, don't try and sell it. You can explain things which are unclear, but there's nothing worse in a business meeting or a group conscience where people just hammer the table until everyone agrees, and everyone eventually... because people will then agree in a group conscience with either the most forceful person in the room or the person playing the biggest victim role, because I've done that. And people afterwards sometimes regret it, but it's just to shut the person up. They just kind of cave, because it's the easiest thing to do. So I think good practice is say the idea once and sit on your hands, even if other people are repeating themselves, because God will allow people to hear that idea and act on it. Then when it doesn't go my way, and it usually doesn't go my way, not to do a flounce delete and, storm out and not to create a fuss, to accept it with grace, quietly knowing that if the wrong decision has been made, it will work itself through, the group will realise and it will correct itself. And then the job is to sit on your hands rather than saying, I told you so. So one's got to be very delicate about these sorts of things. I know you've got some more questions, but a chap over here had something.
Yeah, as I was going through the traditions with my tradition sponsor, we sort of touched on that, like the steps, the traditions are in an order where tradition 1 supersedes the following traditions, not to use as a weapon, but in a way of understanding them. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yes, it's this question of order. The steps are in an order for a reason. However, the reason is not what people think it is. The reason is because in Western civilization we have a linear numbering system. When the steps were introduced in other cultures, and I don't know if this is a true story or an apocryphal one, but I think it speaks to something which is true. The observation was made that it was an error to present the steps in a list because they should be in a circle, because you get to the end and you're back at the beginning. You don't do them and then you're done. I know someone who I think instructingly has since left AA. I remember boasting at a meeting that they'd finished the steps with their sponsor and they got a little cake, put a candle in the cake, and that was the end of that, apparently. And it was the end of that. Left AA 2 years later, steps done, tick. Next. They're not in a line, they're in a circle. But the numbering system doesn't allow for circular numbering, so we've got them in a list. Also, they work in 2 sequences. There's the sequence of 1 to 9, or really there's the preparation of 1, 2, and almost all of step 3 until you take the leap, and that's a period of consideration. And you're doing those considerations all at once. You've already got to buy the idea that AA people are trustworthy before you even start to listen to the material in step 1. On page 58, it says, if you have decided you want what we have, it's got the word feeling in there as well, want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. Want is a feeling, that's why it's in there. So to even begin the steps, you've got to understand the whole program in broad outline, what it is, before you can even know what you're signing up to. So in a sense, you've got to be living the AA life a little while before you can fully take step 3 or even fully start the steps. You've got to be inducted to it. And then you've got 10, 11 and 12, which you start doing, not when you've completed step 9, but right at the beginning. So the fact they're in a sequence, it is helpful that 4 and 5 are before 8 and 9. But honestly, in a sense, they're all done at once. If you have a sequence of 12 glass discs and you place them in a row, it looks as though they're in a row. If you look through them through the end, you're looking through all 12 at once. And I think the steps are like that. You're looking through all 12 at once. It says in the 12 and 12 that as soon as you get into AA, you start making amends by letting people know you're sober and actually being sober and starting to clean up the mess and doing odd little apologies and just starting to sort things out. You don't have to formally get to steps 8 and 9 before changing an awful lot in your relations with other people. Maybe hold back on the really dramatic presentations of, in 1984 I did this to Marjorie and blah, blah, blah. Leave that until you've gone through that with the sponsor, but you can be making amends right from the beginning. You can be carrying the message in step 12 on day 2, telling the people on day 1 how they get from day 1 to day 2. Now, with the traditions, oh, and by the way, when you read the sort of 7 original steps, the order's different. So, orders of things. The thing about the traditions is they're numbered for convenience, but if you removed any of them, the structure would collapse. So it's a little bit like internal organs. It's all very well saying, well, the heart is the most important organ or the brain is the most important organ, but try removing your liver and see how long you last. Try removing your tongue, see how you get on. So how much is each part important? I'm skeptical about things trumping other traditions. One must take the whole body of traditions into account in every situation, in the same way that if you took Susan and you wanted to understand Susan, you'd have to talk to her and meet her and spend some time with her. You wouldn't separate her out into lots of different bits and analyse each of the different bits and think, but there's no Susan left now. There are just the sort of the chunks of what was Susan or whoever it is. And the traditions are like that. If you try to look at them individually, and you rip them from their context, you end up with bleeding chunks of flesh. And this is why there's only one thing worse than not knowing about the traditions, and it's knowing about the traditions, because they make a person dangerous for 10 to 15 years. Because you start to spot the flaw in everything, and then you pull out a tradition and hit someone over the head with it. And it's exactly the same with the concepts as well. One's got to have the spirit behind it in order to be able to apply them. You had another question?
Anyone else have a question?
I do.
Done.
Thank you. Anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. I've often heard the first half of that tradition used to encourage people not to chat or gossip about outside of the rooms, about people inside of the rooms, or about anything they've heard in meetings. Have you any examples about whether or not that first half, anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, does mean not chatting about people outside, and or any examples of how to use this tradition inside AA?
Well, you could have a whole weekend on this. You really could. So the first thing about anonymity, it crops up in a couple of places in the traditions. One of them is in tradition 11. So anonymity at the level of press, radio, TV and film. So I've been on the radio in this country, and I was with a false name, and people that know me recognise me, but there was no way of tracing who I was. Apparently my voice is a little bit distinctive, and that sort of gave the game away to some people. But essentially one does that anonymously, and there are no cameras and so on. But the point of saying we're anonymous at that level is to say that we're in our own everyday lives not to be anonymous. Otherwise you'd say anonymous at every level. It would make no point in saying anonymous at this level if you really mean everything. So the point is, it's left to the discretion of the individual how anonymous to be in the family, at work, in the local community. It's good etiquette not to breach other people's secrets or override their exercise of their own discretion about their membership of AA. But it's interesting, it's very common when people are doing inventory to say, when you say, well, what were the wrongs, or what's the character defect? There's a gossip. You say, well, what do you mean by that? And so, well, I was talking about Sally to Susan, or Susan to Sally. That's not gossip yet. It says in the big book, we talk about each other a great deal, but we almost invariably temper such talk with a spirit of love and tolerance. So the question is, first of all, obviously don't carry tales, and be diplomatic, be discreet, and all of those things. But part of the way that I've learned how to handle the world is by being able to discuss the people I know with selected, trusted individuals in a way that we can figure out what is going on, so that I know how to act, how to respond, how to understand situations. It's an absolutely integral part in human relations is people talking about each other. It's all to do with purpose and spirit, and also respecting certain features of etiquette. But talking about people in AA, outside AA, in other words, leveraging a conversation of someone else's membership of a 12-step fellowship, absolutely not. And one has to be terribly careful that when one breaks one's own, well, one shouldn't say breaking the anonymity, but when one is open oneself, one must remember that the people one is with, they don't necessarily want it broadcast that they're in AA, and people might assume, if I'm talking about AA, I've been in this position, I've been bad on this, is I'm very open, and I forget that if someone knows me and I'm with a friend, they might think, oh, the friend must be in AA, that's how they know each other, and I'm indirectly potentially breaching someone's anonymity there. So I think it's 1 o'clock, so I better go and get a glass of water or something. So.
Thanks, Tim.